In the remote mountains of Colorado, where snow-capped peaks guarded the valley like ancient sentinels, a quiet farmhouse stood nestled in the midst of the wilderness. The air was biting, each breath sharp enough to sting, and the soft rustle of the wind through the pines was the only sound that broke the silence. It was the kind of stillness that carried both peace and foreboding. Evelyn Carter, a seasoned woman of 62, walked the frost-covered path along her property line as dawn broke. Her movements were deliberate, each step reflecting decades of experience. Beside her, Max, a loyal Malinois with keen eyes and a sense of duty as sharp as his mistress's, padded silently. Evelyn's gray eyes scanned the horizon. She had seen too much in her life to ignore the instinct whispering in her ear that something was amiss. Her gaze fell on fresh tire tracks cutting through the frozen ground. The ridges were deep, precise, and recent. Evelyn crouched, running her gloved fingers along the tracks. These weren't local vehicles, too heavy, too deliberate. Max growled low in his throat. His ears pricked as the faint rumble of an engine grew louder. Moments later, Sarah Walker's beat-up pickup came into view, skidding to a halt near the gate. Sarah, a neighbor from 3 miles down the road, stepped out, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched the truck's door for support. "Evelyn, thank God," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Did you hear about the Bennetts?" Evelyn straightened, her sharp features unreadable. "No! What happened?" "They're gone, packed up and left in the middle of the night. No word, no explanation. This morning I saw black SUVs at their place, men with guns." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not from here." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "The Cartel." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the truck tighter. "That's what people in town are saying. They're buying up properties, and the ones who don't sell, well, they find other ways to persuade them." Evelyn's mind raced, piecing together the strategic importance of the valley. It was a perfect nexus for illicit operations. Remote, defensible, with enough hidden routes to move goods undetected. She had seen this before in other places, under other flags. But this wasn't just another mission. This was her home. "Have they approached you?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "Not yet, but they will. They're moving through the valley systematically." Evelyn met Sarah's anxious gaze. "Be careful. Don't let them see you're scared. They thrive on that." Sarah hesitated. "What about you?" "They'll come for your land. It's the most strategic spot." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Let them." After Sarah left, Evelyn returned to her barn, where beneath a layer of hay and tools lay a hidden cellar. She pulled up the false floorboards, revealing weapons and equipment she hadn't touched in years. Radios, rifles, and gear that told stories of missions long buried in classified files. Her hand lingered over a rifle, memories of faces and sacrifices flashing through her mind. She pushed them aside. This wasn't the time for sentiment. As night fell, Evelyn noticed SUVs idling at the edge of her property, their headlights off but their presence unmistakable. Max growled low, sensing the tension. Evelyn made a single call. "Phoenix," she said when the line connected. "It's Carter. I need the team." Evelyn closed the hidden cellar, her mind already working through the logistics of what was to come. She didn't just need to prepare her property, she needed to prepare herself. Years had passed since her last mission, but the instincts never truly faded. The weight of leadership, the calculated decisions, the razor-thin line between survival and failure, it was all familiar. Yet this time was different. This wasn't a foreign battlefield or a government operation. This was personal. The cold wind whipped through the valley as she stepped outside again, her breath clouding the air. Max trotted ahead, his nose close to the ground, his ears swiveling as he picked up distant sounds. Evelyn followed him to the ridge overlooking her property. From there, she could see the faint glow of headlights, barely visible through the trees. The cartel wasn't hiding. They wanted her to know they were there. Her thoughts turned to the valley's history. Generations of families had lived here, farming, hunting, and carving out lives in the rugged terrain. It was a place where people looked out for one another, where strangers became neighbors and neighbors became friends. The thought of the cartel dismantling that way of life filled her with a quiet fury. Returning to the house, Evelyn made her way to the kitchen. She brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table, her fingers tapping against the worn wood. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. The Bennett's sudden departure wasn't just about fear. It was about precision. The cartel had targeted them first for a reason. She reached for the map drawer, pulling out an old topographical layout of the valley. She spread it across the table, marking the Bennett's property with a red pen. Then she circled her own land, noting its proximity to the main highway and the river that cut through the valley. It was clear her property wasn't just a home, it was a tactical advantage. Max barked suddenly, breaking her concentration. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The headlights were gone, but she could feel the tension in the air. They were testing her boundaries, probing for weaknesses. It wasn't just intimidation, it was reconnaissance. Evelyn made another call, this time to an old contact in town. Gary Weston had been the sheriff for 20 years before retiring. He'd seen his share of trouble and knew how to handle himself in a fight. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn?" "This is a surprise," Gary said, his voice gruff but warm. "Gary, I need to know what you've heard about the Bennetts," Evelyn said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've heard plenty, but nothing I can confirm. They left in the dead of night, didn't tell a soul. Word is the cartel's been leaning on folks pretty hard. They're not just leaning, they're planning. They've got SUVs parked near my property, watching." "Damn," Gary muttered. "You need backup?" "Not yet," Evelyn replied, "but I need information. Who else have they approached?" Gary sighed. "Most of the valley's been quiet, but I know they've talked to the Millers and the DeLucas. The Millers sold a month ago, and the DeLucas are holding out, but barely. They're scared, Evelyn. Everyone is." "Not everyone," Evelyn said. "Thanks, Gary. Stay safe." "You too," Gary replied, "and call me if things go south." Evelyn hung up and stared at the map again. The Millers' property was already marked, another key location, near a secondary road. The DeLucas were next, their land bordering hers. If the cartel took their property, they'd have her surrounded. The thought made her chest tighten. She needed to act before the DeLucas were forced out. It wasn't just about defending her own land, it was about stopping the cartel's advance. The next morning, Evelyn drove to the DeLucas' farm. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the frost-covered fields. She found Maria and Carlos DeLuca in the barn, tending to their horses. They looked up as she approached, their expressions wary. "Evelyn," Maria said, her voice tight. "What brings you here?" "I came to talk," Evelyn said. "I know the cartel's been pressuring you. I want to help." Carlos glanced at his wife before speaking. "We don't want trouble, Evelyn. We just want to be left alone." "That's not an option anymore," Evelyn said bluntly. "They won't stop until they have everything they want. And if you do sell, they'll use your land to tighten their grip on the valley." Maria crossed her arms. "And what do you suggest we do? Fight them? We're farmers, not soldiers." "I'm not asking you to fight," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to hold out a little longer. Let me handle the rest." Carlos frowned. "And how are you going to do that?" "I have experience with people like them," Evelyn said carefully. "More experience than I care to admit. But I can't do it alone. If you leave, they'll move in, and my land will be next. But if we stand together, we can stop them." Maria and Carlos exchanged a long look. Finally, Maria nodded. "We'll stay. But if it gets too dangerous?" "I understand," Evelyn said. "But trust me, it's more dangerous to give in." On her way back to her property, Evelyn noticed a black SUV parked near the main road. She slowed her truck, keeping her eyes on the vehicle. The windows were tinted, and she couldn't see who was inside, but she could feel their gaze on her. She drove past without stopping, her mind already forming a plan. That night, she returned to the hidden cellar. She assembled a small surveillance drone, something she hadn't used in years but still knew like the back of her hand. With Max watching from the doorway, she sent the drone into the night sky, its quiet hum blending with the wind. From the monitor in the barn, she watched as the drone captured images of the SUV and the surrounding area. There were two men inside, both armed, their faces partially obscured. She recorded their movements, noting the way they communicated with someone over the radio. They weren't just watching, they were coordinating. Evelyn's hands tightened into fists. The cartel wasn't just a threat to her land, they were a threat to the entire valley, and she was going to make sure they knew they had underestimated her. As she brought the drone back, she glanced at the old mission patches pinned to the wall of the barn. Each one represented a battle fought, a victory earned, a price paid. This wasn't just about protecting her home. This was about proving that the valley wasn't theirs to take. The night stretched on, the cold seeping into her bones, but Evelyn didn't rest. She mapped out every detail, every contingency. The cartel thought they were predators, circling their prey. But they didn't realize they had stepped into the den of a far more dangerous predator, one who had nothing left to lose. Evelyn rose before dawn the next morning, her breath clouding the icy air as she stepped outside. The valley was cloaked in a pale gray mist, the kind that dampened sound and shrouded movement. Max trailed behind her, alert and watchful. Today wasn't about preparation. She retrieved a small black case from the hidden cellar and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside was a set of compact surveillance equipment, tiny, nearly invisible cameras and motion sensors she had once used on missions that didn't officially exist. These tools weren't meant for warfare. They were for gathering information, creating an edge when the odds seemed impossible. Evelyn started by installing the equipment at key points along her property. The perimeter was already dotted with traps and hidden vantage points, but now she needed eyes and ears everywhere. Max stayed by her side, sniffing the ground as she placed a camera inside a hollowed-out log, a motion sensor beneath a patch of moss. Each tool blended seamlessly into the environment, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. When the setup was complete, she moved on to Phase 2, reconnaissance. The cartel thought they had the upper hand, but Evelyn was determined to prove them wrong. She loaded a small pack with supplies and set out toward the ridge where she had spotted the black SUV the day before. The hike was steep, the frost-covered ground crunching beneath her boots. Max trotted ahead, occasionally pausing to sniff the air. When they reached the ridge, Evelyn crouched low, using the cover of a thick pine tree to peer down at the road below. The SUV was still there, parked in the same spot. Two men leaned against the vehicle, talking and smoking cigarettes. They didn't appear concerned, arrogance disguised as confidence. Evelyn pulled out a small parabolic microphone from her pack and adjusted its settings. A faint hum filled her headphones as she aimed the device at the men, focusing on their conversation. "Boss says we're moving in tomorrow night," one of the men said, his voice clear through the static. "She won't know what hit her." The other man chuckled. "You think she's just gonna roll over? I heard she's got a reputation." The first man scoffed. "Reputation or not, she's just one woman. You've seen the team we've got. This is over before it starts." Evelyn smirked, lowering the microphone. They had no idea what they were walking into, but the mention of tomorrow night stuck with her. She had less than 24 hours to finalize her defenses and to send a message. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn contacted Gary again. This time, her request was specific. "Gary, I need something from your old stockpile," she said. There was a pause on the line. "You're asking for a lot, Evelyn." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't necessary." Gary sighed. "Fine. I'll meet you at the usual spot in an hour." Evelyn hung up and grabbed her truck keys. She drove to a secluded clearing a few miles from her property, the engine rumbling softly in the still morning air. Gary was already there, leaning against his truck with a wooden crate at his feet. "Don't make me regret this," he said as she approached. "You won't," Evelyn replied. She opened the crate, revealing an assortment of smoke grenades, flashbangs, and other non-lethal tools. They weren't military grade, but they'd do the job. Evelyn loaded the crate into her truck and nodded to Gary. "Thank you," she said. "Just stay alive," Gary replied. "The valley can't afford to lose you." As she drove back, Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities. The smoke grenades and flashbangs would give her an edge, but she needed more than firepower. She needed psychological warfare. The cartel relied on fear to control their enemies. It was time to turn that fear against them. That evening, Evelyn set her plan into motion. She started by using Ava's old comms equipment to tap into the cartel's radio frequency. It didn't take long to intercept a conversation between Victor Reyes and his team. "We move at dusk tomorrow," Victor's voice crackled through the speakers. "No mistakes this time. She's alone, and we're bringing enough firepower to level that farmhouse." Evelyn's lips curled into a grim smile. They thought she was alone, a mistake she intended to exploit. She spent the rest of the night creating diversions. Using her drone, she dropped small explosive charges at random points around the valley, sending flashes of light and echoing booms through the darkness. The cartel's radio chatter erupted with confusion as they tried to locate the source of the explosions. "What the hell is going on out there?" one voice demanded. "No idea," another replied. "Could be hunters, but it's too coordinated." Evelyn listened silently, her fingers hovering over the controls. She didn't need to engage them directly, not yet. The goal was to keep them on edge, to make them question every shadow and sound. The next day passed in a blur of activity. Evelyn fortified her defenses, reinforcing barricades and adding layers of camouflage to her traps. She placed the smoke grenades and flashbangs at strategic points, ensuring she could deploy them quickly when the time came. Max followed her every step, his presence a steady comfort amidst the chaos. As dusk approached, Evelyn climbed to the roof of her barn, using the high vantage point to survey the valley. The cartel's convoy was on the move, a line of black SUVs snaking through the trees. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady as she adjusted the scope on her rifle. This was it. The first SUV reached the edge of her property, its engine rumbling as it came to a stop. Men spilled out, armed and scanning the area. Evelyn watched as Victor Reyes stepped out of the lead vehicle, his polished demeanor intact despite the tension in the air. "Spread out," he ordered. "She's here somewhere." Evelyn waited until they were deep inside her perimeter before making her move. She fired a single shot, not to hit, but to warn. The bullet struck the ground near Victor's feet, sending up a spray of dirt. Victor froze, his gaze snapping to the barn. "She's up there! Take her out!" The men opened fire, bullets ripping through the wooden walls of the barn. Evelyn ducked behind cover, her pulse steady as she activated the first set of traps. Explosions erupted across the property, smoke and debris filling the air. The cartel's formation crumbled as they scrambled for cover. Evelyn moved like a ghost, her rifle slung across her back as she deployed smoke grenades to obscure her movements. She used the chaos to her advantage, picking off targets one by one. Max darted through the shadows, his growls and sudden appearances adding to the confusion. By the time the dust settled, the cartel was in full retreat. Victor stood at the edge of the property, his face pale but defiant. "This isn't over," he shouted. Evelyn stepped out of the shadows, her rifle trained on him. "Yes, it is." Victor hesitated, his hand hovering near his weapon, but something in Evelyn's gaze stopped him. Without another word, he turned and climbed into his SUV, the tires kicking up gravel as the convoy disappeared into the night. As the silence returned to the valley, Evelyn lowered her rifle. Max trotted to her side, his tail wagging slightly. She knelt down, resting a hand on his head. "It's over," she said softly. "For now." The valley was safe, for the moment, but Evelyn knew the fight wasn't finished. The cartel would regroup, and they would come back stronger. But so would she. This was her home, and she would defend it with everything she had. Evelyn spent the next few days walking her property, assessing the damage and patching up what she could. The barn's walls were riddled with bullet holes, the ground still bore the scars of explosions, and a few of her traps had been rendered useless in the chaos. Max followed closely, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Though the cartel had retreated, Evelyn knew it wasn't the end. Inside the house, she set up a new command center in what had once been a storage room. The old desk was now covered with maps, notes, and a portable radio system she had recovered from the cellar. She monitored the intercepted cartel communications, keeping track of their movements. The silence on their end wasn't reassuring, it was ominous. They were regrouping, and the next attack would be even more calculated. Later that afternoon, Gary Weston paid her a visit. He arrived in his old truck, its engine rumbling as he pulled into the driveway. Evelyn met him on the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Gary," she said, nodding in greeting. "Thought I'd check in," he replied, his expression grim. "Heard about what happened, you okay?" "I'm fine. Evelyn said, though the fatigue in her eyes betrayed her. "But they'll be back." Gary stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I talked to some people in town. Word is, Victor Reyes wasn't just anyone. He's one of the cartel's top lieutenants. Taking him down, that's gonna bring some serious heat." Evelyn nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. That's why I need your help." Gary raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I need to cut off their resources before they can regroup. They're using the valley as a hub, but they're getting supplies from somewhere nearby. If I can find their supply line, I can disrupt their operation." Gary frowned, scratching his chin. "There's a warehouse near the edge of town. Used to be a distribution center for the logging company, but it's been abandoned for years. Rumor has it, the cartel's been using it as a storage facility." "That's a start," Evelyn said. "Can you get me the layout of the place?" Gary hesitated. "I can try, but you're walking into a hornet's nest. You sure about this?" "I don't have a choice," Evelyn replied. "If I wait for them to come to me, they'll bring everything they've got. I need to stay ahead of them." Gary sighed, shaking his head. "All right, I'll get you what you need. Just be careful, Evelyn. The valley can't lose you." That night, Evelyn prepared for the mission. She packed light: a compact rifle, a silenced pistol, and a small satchel of tools. Max paced the living room, sensing her focus. "You're staying here," Evelyn told him firmly. Max whined in protest, but she scratched behind his ears. "I need you to keep watch. I'll be back." As she drove toward the warehouse, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. She parked her truck a mile away and approached on foot, moving silently through the shadows. The warehouse loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls rusted and weathered. A few dim lights glowed near the entrances, and Evelyn spotted 2 guards patrolling the perimeter. She crouched behind a cluster of bushes, observing their movements. They were sloppy, too confident in their numbers to notice the gaps in their patrols. Evelyn used those gaps to her advantage, slipping past them and finding an open window near the back of the building. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and damp wood. Stacks of crates filled the space, each marked with coded labels. Evelyn moved carefully, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor. She paused near one of the crates, using her knife to pry it open. Inside, she found weapons: assault rifles, ammunition, and grenades. Another crate held bags of a white powder she didn't need to analyze to know its purpose. She took photos of everything, her small camera clicking softly in the stillness. This wasn't just a storage facility, it was a major hub for the cartel's operations. If she could dismantle this, she'd deal them a significant blow. Evelyn continued deeper into the warehouse, her senses on high alert. She reached the main office, its door slightly ajar. Inside, a single man sat at a desk, flipping through a ledger. He was unarmed, but Evelyn didn't let her guard down. She stepped into the room, her pistol trained on him. "Don't move," she said quietly. The man froze, his hands raised. Who are you?" "That's not important," Evelyn replied. "What's in the crates?" The man hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't know, I just work here." "Wrong answer," Evelyn said, her voice cold. "Try again." "They're shipments," he stammered. "Weapons, drugs, everything the cartel needs to keep their operation running. Please." "I don't want any trouble." Evelyn gestured for him to stand. "You're coming with me." She led him out of the office, keeping her pistol trained on him as they made their way back toward the exit. But as they approached the door, a sudden shout echoed through the warehouse. "Hey, who's there?" Evelyn cursed under her breath. The guards had noticed her. She pushed the man behind a stack of crates and raised her rifle, firing a single shot that hit one of the guards in the leg. The other guard dove for cover, shouting for reinforcements. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Evelyn moved quickly, using the crates as cover as she exchanged fire with the guards. Her movements were precise, each shot calculated, but she knew she couldn't hold them off forever. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small explosive charge. Setting the timer for 30 seconds, she placed it near one of the larger stacks of crates and made her way toward the exit. The guards were closing in, their shouts growing louder. Just as she reached the window, the explosive detonated, The blast shook the warehouse, sending debris flying and knocking the guards off their feet. Evelyn didn't look back as she climbed through the window and disappeared into the night. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn reviewed the photos she had taken. The evidence was damning, proof of the cartel's activities and the extent of their operations. She sent the files to an old contact in law enforcement, someone she trusted to act without tipping off the cartel. By morning, news of the explosion had spread. The warehouse was in ruins, and the cartel was scrambling to recover. Evelyn listened to their frantic radio chatter, a small sense of satisfaction blooming in her chest. She had bought herself time, but she knew the fight wasn't over. As she sat on the porch, Max resting at her feet, Evelyn allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The valley was quiet again, the mountains standing tall and unyielding against the horizon. She had made her move, but the war was far from finished, and Evelyn Carter wasn't done fighting. Evelyn's temporary victory gave her some breathing room, but the quiet that followed was uneasy, charged with the promise of retaliation. She knew the cartel was regrouping, and their next move wouldn't be as disorganized or predictable. They had underestimated her once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The early morning air was sharp as she sat on the porch, sipping coffee and stroking Max's head absently. She could feel the weight of what was coming, not just for herself, but for the valley. The cartel wasn't just targeting her property. They were targeting everything the valley represented. Her neighbors, like Sarah and the DeLucas, didn't have her training or resources. They needed someone to stand up for them, and Evelyn was ready to take on that responsibility. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel. She set her coffee down and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall, motioning for Max to stay. A black truck emerged from the tree line, but it wasn't Cartel. Gary Weston climbed out, holding a folder under his arm. "Got some updates," he said as he approached. "Thought you'd want to see these." Evelyn motioned for him to sit at the table, and he spread the folder out. Inside were satellite images, maps, and handwritten notes. "You were right about the warehouse," Gary said. "That place was a hub. But here's the thing. They've got more. We dug up intel on another site just outside the valley. It's bigger, better guarded, and it looks like it's where they're stockpiling their heavy equipment." Evelyn studied the images, her sharp eyes scanning for weaknesses. The site was an old mining facility repurposed for the cartel's use. Its location was strategic, tucked into a narrow gorge with limited access points. It wouldn't be easy to infiltrate, but that didn't deter her. "They're preparing for something big," Gary continued. "We've intercepted chatter about reinforcements coming in from out of state. Whatever they're planning, they're not holding back." Evelyn nodded. "Then neither can we." Gary hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Look, Evelyn, you've already done more than anyone could have asked for. But this is dangerous. You can't do it alone." "I don't intend to," she said. "It's time to call in more help." Later that day, Evelyn made a series of calls. Her old team had scattered across the country, each of them settling into lives far removed from the chaos of their past missions. But when Evelyn explained the situation, they didn't hesitate. By nightfall, her team began to arrive. First was Jake, the sniper with unerring precision, his calm demeanor unchanged by the years. Leah, the demolitions expert, was next, her sharp wit as cutting as ever. Ava, the tech genius, showed up last, her laptop already humming with activity. Tess, the medic, joined them via a secure video call, unable to be there in person but ready to provide remote support. The reunion was brief, their focus entirely on the mission ahead. "Here's what we know," Evelyn said, spreading out the intel on the dining table. "The mining facility is their primary stockpile. If we take it out, we cripple their ability to operate in the valley." Jake studied the maps, nodding. "Sniper points here and here," he said, tapping the high ridges overlooking the gorge. "Good visibility, limited exposure." Leia grinned. "And I can rig these access points with enough explosives to take out half their convoy." Ava leaned forward, typing rapidly on her laptop. "I'll disable their communications. They won't be able to call for reinforcements." Evelyn looked at each of them, her expression resolute. "This isn't just about stopping them. It's about sending a message. They think they can take this valley from us. We're going to show them how wrong they are." The mission began under the cover of darkness. Evelyn and Jake positioned themselves on the ridge, their rifles trained on the facility below. Leah and Ava moved into position near the main access road, while Tess monitored their progress from a secure location miles away. Through her scope, Evelyn could see the facility's activity. Trucks moved in and out, carrying crates and fuel tanks. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical but predictable. "Targets marked," Jake said quietly, his voice steady. "Ready on your command." Evelyn tapped her radio. Leah, status?" "Charge is set," Leah replied. "Just say the word." "Ava?" "Comms are down," Ava said. "They're blind." Evelyn took a deep breath. "All teams, execute." The first explosion rocked the facility, a plume of fire and smoke erupting from the access road. Guards shouted, scrambling to respond, but Leia's traps triggered in sequence, cutting off their escape routes. Jake's rifle cracked, each shot precise and deadly. Evelyn fired alongside him, taking out key targets to sow further chaos. Below, Leah moved through the shadows, planting additional charges near the fuel tanks. Ava monitored the situation from a safe distance, feeding real-time updates to the team. "2 vehicles inbound," Ava warned. "Looks like reinforcements." Jake adjusted his scope, his voice calm. "Not for long." 2 quick shots disabled the lead vehicle, sending it careening into a ditch. The second vehicle skidded to a halt, its occupants hesitating before retreating under heavy fire. Inside the facility, guards attempted to regroup, but Evelyn's team was relentless. Leah detonated the final charges, and the resulting explosion engulfed the stockpile in flames. The roar of the fire echoed through the gorge, a vivid testament to their victory. "Mission accomplished," Evelyn said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Fall back." The team retreated to their vehicles, the glow of the burning facility lighting their path. By the time they reached the farmhouse, dawn was breaking over the valley. They were battered and weary, but alive and victorious. As they gathered in the kitchen, sipping coffee and tending to minor injuries, the weight of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The cartel's primary operation in the valley was destroyed, their resources crippled. But Evelyn knew it wasn't the end. "They'll come back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not tomorrow, maybe not even next month, but they'll come." Jake nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Leah grinned, raising her coffee mug. "To the valley, and to making sure it stays ours." The team shared a brief moment of camaraderie before turning their attention to the future. There were still challenges ahead, but for now, the valley was safe. Evelyn looked out the window, the mountains standing tall and unyielding against the morning light. She had fought for her home and won, but the fight for the valley's soul was far from over. And Evelyn Carter wasn't done yet. Enjoyed this story? Watch the next video for another great one, and be sure to subscribe for more exciting tales.